I never imagined betrayal could come from the people I once rocked to sleep. But there I was, sitting at the long mahogany dining table, staring at the polished surface that once reflected laughter and candlelight, now reflecting only my hollow eyes. My husband's portrait hung above the fireplace, his gentle smile watching over me as if he, too, couldn't believe what our children had done. It started with a letter. A thin, cream-colored envelope with the law firm's insignia embossed in gold. I thought it was another condolence notice, another dry reminder that Edward was gone. But when I slid it open, my world cracked. Per the terms of Mr. Harrington's will, the words blurred as I read them. All assets, our home, the business, the investments, had been transferred to our children, Mark and Emily. There was no mention of me. No provision. Nothing. I remember laughing at first, a strange, nervous laugh that sounded foreign to my own ears. Surely, it had to be a mistake. Edward loved me. He wouldn't have left me with nothing. We'd built our lives together from the ground up, side by side through every storm and triumph. But the letter didn't lie, and neither did the lawyer, who confirmed it in his careful, pitying tone. Your husband made these changes 6 months before his passing, he said, folding his hands on the polished desk. I'm afraid everything was finalized and legally binding. 6 months. That was around the time Edward's health had begun to decline. I had been taking care of him, making soup, changing bandages, holding his hand through the pain. How could he have changed everything without telling me? Mark and Emily arrived later that evening. Their faces were polite, rehearsed. They didn't even look at me the way they used to, as their mother, but rather as an inconvenience they now had to manage. Mom, Dad wanted us to handle things, Mark said gently, too gently. He had Edward's sharp jawline, but none of his warmth. Emily chimed in, brushing her hair behind her ear. You'll be comfortable. We'll make sure of that. Maybe we can set up a small place for you in the countryside, something peaceful. A small place? As if the home I'd spent 30 years in was just another piece of real estate to be relocated. I watched them move around the house, their voices calm and confident, their eyes scanning rooms filled with memories as if appraising their worth. In that moment, I realized they weren't here to console me. They were here to claim what was theirs, or what they believed was theirs. And that's when the first sting of doubt crept in. Had Edward truly done this on his own, or had someone helped him? The letter, the timing, their composure, it all felt too neat, too deliberate. Something was wrong, and for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize my own children. Before Edward's death, our lives had been built on a foundation I thought was unshakable. Family dinners, quiet mornings, laughter echoing through these same hallways. We were never the perfect family, but there was love, or at least I believed there was. Edward was the kind of man whose presence commanded attention without trying. He was patient, calculating, a man who never raised his voice but always got his way. His charm built empires. His silence held secrets. When we met, I was a schoolteacher with ink stains on my fingers and dreams far larger than my bank account. He was already successful, already burdened by wealth. I never cared for the money. I loved the man, the way he would pause before answering, as if words carried weight. The way he once told me, "You make this house a home, Margaret." Our children, Mark and Emily, grew up surrounded by privilege, though I tried to keep them grounded. Mark, the eldest, inherited his father's discipline, but not his compassion. He had a mind for numbers and a hunger for control. Emily, my sweet girl, had Edward's grace, but an ambition that sometimes frightened me. She wanted the world to notice her, wanted to be seen, admired, envied. As the years passed, I watched small shifts in them. Family dinners turned into business discussions. Holidays became performances of affection rather than celebrations of love. Edward, always the mediator, encouraged their drive, saying, "The Harringtons build legacies, not excuses." I'd smile through it all, convincing myself it was pride, not distance, that had settled into our home. When Edward fell ill, everything changed. The children visited often, at first out of love, then, I suspect, out of duty. Mark began managing Edward's affairs, handling meetings from the study that I was no longer invited into. Emily flitted between compassion and distraction, her visits shorter, her hugs less warm. I was too busy tending to Edward's weakening frame to notice the walls closing in around me. Now, in the wake of his death, I look back on those months with painful clarity. The late-night calls Mark took on the balcony. The whispered conversations between Emily and her father when they thought I was asleep. The stack of documents I wasn't allowed to touch because it would only worry me. Maybe Edward had been manipulated. Maybe grief had made him vulnerable. Or maybe I had never known the man as well as I thought I did. That thought haunts me most. The idea that love can coexist with deception, that devotion can blind you to betrayal. The night before the reading of the will, I found myself in Edward's study, running my fingers along the bookshelves, searching for some sign of him. Instead, I found a locked drawer. And in that moment, for the first time since his death, I felt something stir within me. Not grief, but resolve. Whatever truth was buried here, I would find it. The drawer wouldn't open at first. The lock was old, stubborn, like the man who once guarded its contents. I tried a dozen keys from Edward's ring before one finally turned. The click echoed through the silent room, sharp and final, as if I had crossed an invisible line between widowhood and truth. Inside were files, letters, and one small black notebook with Edward's handwriting on the cover. His handwriting, steady, deliberate, unmistakably his. My hands trembled as I opened it. Most of the pages were filled with notes about his business holdings, but near the end, something shifted. His sentences became personal, reflective. He wrote about his fear of dying, his doubts about the children's intentions, and his disappointment in how distant they'd become. Then came one sentence that shattered everything I thought I knew. If Margaret ever reads this, it means I failed to protect her. I froze. Protect me from what? Or worse, whom? The next morning, I confronted Mark. He was sitting in the living room, his laptop open, surrounded by papers he claimed were financial transfers. I placed the notebook in front of him. "Explain this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't even look surprised. Just sighed, closed the laptop, and leaned back. "Mom, you shouldn't go digging through Dad's things. There are complexities you wouldn't understand." Complexities. That word again, the same one Edward used when he wanted to keep me out of business conversations. It wasn't protection. It was exclusion. "What did you and your sister do?" I pressed. What was he afraid of? Mark's expression hardened. "Dad made his decisions. You were always too emotional to see the bigger picture. He wanted the company to stay in capable hands." Capable? I repeated, feeling the word burn my tongue. "You mean greedy?" Before he could respond, Emily entered, her voice honeyed and soft. "Mom, please. Don't do this now. You're grieving. We all are." But I saw it, the flicker in her eyes, the quick glance at Mark. They were hiding something. That evening, I took the notebook to Edward's former lawyer, Mr. Collins, a man whose loyalty had always seemed to lie with my husband. His face drained of color when he read the page. "Mrs. Harrington," he said slowly, "your husband suspected the children were pressuring him. There were meetings I wasn't invited to, documents I never reviewed." My chest tightened. "So, they made him change the will?" He hesitated. "I can't prove that. But I believe Edward regretted it. There was talk of drafting a revision, but he passed before it was signed." The world tilted. Everything, the will, the inheritance, my children's sudden politeness, fit together with chilling precision. I walked home through the evening mist, the city lights blurring like tears I refused to shed. For the first time in weeks, my grief gave way to something far colder. They had taken everything from me: money, home, even Edward's final act of love. But I still had the truth. And that was something I could use, that I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, the notebook clutched to my chest, listening to the grandfather clock tick through the dark hours like a metronome of betrayal. Every sound in the house felt amplified: the whisper of wind through the curtains, the creak of floorboards, the faint hum of a refrigerator keeping food cold for a family that no longer existed. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Mark and Emily had arranged another meeting with the estate's financial advisor in Edward's old study. I waited until they were deep in conversation before I walked in, calm but deliberate, holding the notebook and a sealed envelope I'd taken from Mr. Collins's office, the one Edward had written but never mailed. "Am I interrupting?" I asked, though my voice already commanded the room. Emily straightened in her chair, startled. Mark's expression flickered from irritation to caution. "What are you doing, Mom?" he said, his tone measured, patronizing. I placed the envelope on the table between them. "I think your father deserves a voice in this conversation." Mark frowned, but didn't touch it. I opened it myself and began to read aloud. "If anything happens to me before I can make the changes, I need Margaret to know the truth. I am not the man she thinks I am, not because of deceit, but because I have allowed fear to silence me. The children have grown ambitious beyond my control. I wanted to protect her, but I signed the papers anyway, thinking I could fix it later. If she ever finds this letter, tell her I tried." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Emily's lips parted in disbelief. Mark's jaw clenched. "You knew," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "You both knew he was ill, vulnerable. You manipulated him into rewriting the will while I was caring for him." Mark stood, his calm veneer fracturing. "You don't understand what he built, what was at stake. You were never part of the business, Mom. You would have ruined it with sentiment." Sentiment. I laughed bitterly. "You mean love? Compassion? The very things that made this family worth anything." Emily began to cry, softly at first, then uncontrollably. "He promised us, Mom. He said he'd make it right. We thought we were securing the future." "The future?" I whispered. "And what of mine?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Mark's gaze softened just slightly, but not enough to undo what he'd done. "It's too late to change anything now," he murmured. "The assets are already transferred." I closed the notebook, feeling something inside me settle, not peace, not forgiveness, but clarity. "Then you've already lost more than you'll ever realize," I said quietly, "because you traded your father's love and your mother's trust for numbers on a page." I turned to leave, my reflection glancing back from the glass cabinet, smaller, older, but unbroken. For the first time in months, I felt steady on my feet. The truth had burned through the lies, and what remained was strength. But I knew this wasn't the end. The Harringtons had built legacies, yes, just not the kind they'd expected. Weeks passed, and the house grew quieter. The echoes of voices, once familiar and comforting, had faded into memory. Mark and Emily rarely called now. When they did, their words felt formal, like business correspondences rather than conversations between blood. I didn't mind. The silence, I realized, was kinder than their pity. After the confrontation, I'd packed a single suitcase and left the mansion behind. The lawyers could keep their ledgers and documents. I no longer wished to live among the ghosts of betrayal. I moved into a small cottage by the coast, a place Edward and I once visited before the children were born. The sea air was sharp and honest, the kind of air that didn't lie. Every morning, I'd sit by the window overlooking the water with a cup of tea, the same notebook resting beside me. I'd reread Edward's words, not to reopen old wounds, but to remind myself that truth, however painful, is a form of love. He hadn't meant to leave me defenseless. He'd simply been too human, too afraid to face what his own children had become. There were nights when I still dreamed of them as children, Mark chasing seagulls at the beach, Emily braiding wildflowers into my hair. In those moments, I grieved not for my lost fortune, but for the loss of something far rarer: innocence. Somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced affection, and pride had buried gratitude. But grief, I've learned, is not a permanent state. It's a landscape you learn to navigate. Some days I walk through valleys of anger. Others, I find peaks of forgiveness. It's the in-between that teaches you who you really are. Last week, I received a letter from Emily. It was short, hesitant, almost apologetic. She wrote that she'd been reading her father's journals and that she now understood how much I'd sacrificed. She asked if she could visit, not to talk about money, just to see me. I haven't answered yet. Part of me wants to open the door, to find a fragment of the girl who once kissed my cheek goodnight. Another part fears that letting her back in would reopen wounds that have only just begun to scar. Still, when I stand at the shoreline, watching the tide erase footprints in the sand, I think about Edward's last words. I tried. And I realize I'm trying, too, in my own way, to forgive, to rebuild, to keep loving in a world that betrayed me. They may have taken everything tangible, but what they couldn't take was the one thing Edward and I built before the money ever came: resilience. As the waves break against the shore, I whisper to the wind, not as a widow or a mother wronged, but as a woman reborn. I may have lost the fortune, but I have finally found myself. And in that quiet truth, I am rich again.